Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, Nicholas Boni. He's a writer, photographer, musician based in Brooklyn, who's written a piece in the Jacobin. Social housing for New York is on the table. And also with us is Cea Weaver, tenant organizer with Housing Justice for All in New York. Welcome to the both of you. Nicholas, let's just start with you. What is the housing situation in New York State? I mean, I think people know, but give us some numbers.
Yeah. First of all, hello. Thanks for having us on. It's great to come on and be able to talk about this very dire situation that we are all living in. So, New York State and New York City are in the middle of an affordability crisis. I think that's something that could have been credibly said at any point in the last, 50 to 100 years, but we're especially seeing a big problem with it right now. We are looking at a really dire lack of available, affordable housing with stable rents. We have seen some really poor investment from the state over the last few decades into the construction of new permanently affordable housing. The vehicle for that in the past couple of decades has been through the 421A program, which is a tax abatement for private developers to build mostly these new shiny luxury buildings that we see go up and rent a small proportion of them at affordability in big quotes, that are not affordable to a majority of people and can often require you to have a certifiable income that is close to or above six figures to get into these supposedly affordable units.
Yeah, I should say we broadcast, almost like in the heart of that. I mean, we look around. There's a ton of new building that's going up, particularly in downtown Brooklyn and in the Gowanus area, and it's all got that dynamic. To get in there, 20% of it is there, maybe a certain percentage under the median, and then some is like some affordable is actually goes higher than the median, which is sort of a blinkered. Before we get back to, so that's sort of the problem. And we should say this is both a problem in New York City. It's a problem across the country. What I think is a little bit unique about this era of unaffordability, and a lot of this is coming, is even made more, I think, intense because following the 2008 financial crisis, there was just building halted for an extended period of time. But if you go up the Hudson River to places like Ulster County and Greene County and Sullivan County, we're seeing a lot of squeezing of people there. There's a lot of problems with housing affordability, which is a relatively new phenomenon, I think, in part, sort of like in the wake of COVID. But with that said, Cea Weaver, you're a Housing Justice for All organizer, a tenant organizer. What does your organization do?
Hi, thanks for having me. So Housing Justice for All is a statewide coalition of local grassroots tenants' rights organizations that are, bringing together tenants to fight for more affordable housing. So we're a statewide network, and we bring together these organizations to fight for stronger tenant protections and more deeply affordable, decommodified public sector housing in Albany. New York State, like many states, is a relatively weak home rule place, which means that most housing policy actually is dictated not at the level of the mayor or the city council, but the governor and the state legislature. Unsurprisingly, that means that the real estate industry is regularly the largest donors to New York State politicians, and our goal as Housing Justice for All is to be a counterweight to that power. We want to challenge the real estate industry over who gets to dictate affordable housing policy and housing policy in the state, and we have had some strong victories, and we hope to have more with our new proposal for social housing.
Yeah, Nicholas, why don't you just walk us through, what the outlines of that legislation is, and it is And where in the process it is. Well, just tell us a little bit about the legislation first, and then we'll get to like where it's at.
Yeah, sure. So the bill that we are talking about, that the article is about, and that we're advocating for here, would create the Social Housing Development Authority. So this would be a statewide housing authority that would be empowered to rezone, rehabilitate distressed properties, acquire new land, and construct new publicly built, publicly owned, deeply affordable housing that is under democratic control. This is different from existing public housing authorities like NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, for example, in that the base of tenants that would be this would be available to is much wider in terms of income limits. NYCHA constructed a bunch of affordable housing, but currently houses, I think I read that the average income in NYCHA properties is, we're talking about the poverty line or below. And so that causes a constant revenue issues with NYCHA, which leads to things like deferred maintenance and, some of the, as always, the underinvestment in this public good leads to this public perception that the government is failing when what it's suffering from is a dire lack of investment and revenue. So the Social Housing Development Authority, the units that are going to be managed by this authority are going to be available to a wider base of people in New York. So you don't have to be the absolutely most destitute and impoverished person that we can possibly find to be eligible to enter this thing. We want to see a mix of incomes and backgrounds, and that will really create a more dependable and self-sustaining revenue stream, alongside the authority's ability to interact with existing public housing authorities. But
so,
the other
so let me just see if I could get you to just weigh in this. So this is going to be self-sustaining ultimately, but it needs essentially like seed investment. And we're talking about how much money do we need as more or less, I guess, what would constitute a line of credit for this. And ostensibly, we're losing billions of dollars annually because of all these sort of tax abatements that we're providing in the system that we're using now. So that has like a more hidden or obscured cost. This would have an upfront, essentially, line of credit, but would ultimately become far more sustainable. How much of that money is necessary? And then, like, also, what would be the process of this agency coming in? Like, how would they would they buy distressed properties? Would they buy, like, how would that work?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So the first question is that we really want this entity, the Social Housing Authority, to be able to scale and to be able to produce a lot of housing. We think that that's really important in order to sort of challenge the speculative role that the real estate industry plays in our city and in our state. And so we want it to be able to compete with the private market. And we think that's what will make it successful, is if there's a true public sector alternative to our existing speculative and profit-driven housing system. We're asking for a $5 billion sort of initial investment. With that $5 billion, we hope to be able to set up and staff the agency, but also build new housing across the state, as well as acquire distressed housing across the state. The mechanisms for acquiring distressed housing could look different on a building by building basis. In some cases, what happens is tenants form a tenant association. They have a scofflaw landlord or someone who's not making repairs, and they could pressure, using organizing tactics, they could pressure to the Social Housing Development Authority to take over their homes, to buy their homes. In other cases, it might happen through like a legal process. A couple of days ago, one of the most notorious slumlords in the city, his name is Ob Shalom. He was arrested because he is treating his tenants so badly, hundreds of thousands of open code violations. In cases like that, where the city is actively pursuing already sort of litigation and enforcement mechanisms against the landlord, the SHDA is an option. We can say, hey, you are not maintaining this building, and we are the city of New York. We have an interest in making sure that housing is well maintained, and we're going to take this building away from you.
Would you need a host of like a new suite of regulations that sort of function maybe in the same way that, let's say, National Labor Relations Board says there's unfair labor practices. In this instance, there's unfair housing practices. You've made these violations. That in and of itself, we don't need to, once we've established you've made these violations, you've made, I don't know, three strikes, you're out. We're going to pay you the market value, I guess, of the property. Is that what happens at that point, and take it over, or do they?
That's a good question. We don't really think that we need new regulations to make that happen right now, because the city of New York already has this enforcement power for many, many years. I don't know, if you think about the Lower East Side in, the 1970s and tenants who are squatting their buildings. Those buildings later became, shared equity cooperatives. And there's a long history of similar things like that happening in New York through different iterations of public policy and public programs that allow tenants and community members to sort of actively intervene when a landlord is behaving badly to bring that building into the affordable housing universe. The problem with our existing programs is that they don't really have the capital to scale. And so they end up operating at a pretty a hyper local neighborhood-based level, where tenants are organizing for years and years and years and years and years to get the city to take advantage of things like the 7A program or things like the third-party transfer program. And they're difficult to use because they're so small scale. The SHDA, to me, offers an opportunity to take those existing programs and sort of supercharge them so that we can be supporting tenants and moving faster than our existing programs to bring things in and to, take over a lot of distressed housing. In some cases, yes, I think we're imagining that the city that the Social Housing Development Authority would pay a market transaction for that building. But there's all sorts of things that organized tenants can do to drive down that market price, especially if, we have strong rent controls, we are discouraging speculation through other public policy. Tenants are suing the landlord. So this case is like the building is less attractive to other market participants because there's a lot of liability associated with the lawsuit. And so there's things that organized tenants can do to sort of make a deal more possible. And that's the kind of organizing that is going to have to happen in order to make the SHDA live up to the vision.
And does the agency sell essentially the property to the tenants, or do they retain ownership of it? And what are the tax implications? Are we still paying property tax on these properties?
These are such good questions. You're really getting to the heart of housing policy in our city and state. What we're envisioning is that the SHDA would continue to hold the land underneath the building, and that would allow it to provide its role as sort of stewarding this property and making sure it is well maintained, making sure it has the money to run, and it would allow us to pool the sort of property, the income at that property with other buildings across the state that the SHDA might own. But the tenants would create a corporation, a cooperation, and they would each own, collectively, they would form a tenant association, and that tenant association, residents association, would collectively own the building that is sitting on top of the land. That's what's called
and we should tell people,
cooperative.
People who are not in New York should understand that, we have co-ops, I don't know what percentage, but a ton of the buildings in this city, there's probably more co-ops than there are condos. So this concept of basically you're leasing your apartment and you get shares. What you're buying is shares in a co-op. They give you a certain number of shares. Those shares correspond with your apartment. You're actually technically leasing it from the cooperative there. Nicholas, where else has this ever been done? This type of arrangement?
Yeah, so this is not a new radical idea that we are pulling out of thin air, but this is a model of housing construction and ownership that has been tested in the past and exists and is already successfully operating elsewhere. There are, in the United States, there's an example of a suburb outside of Washington, D.C. that has constructed a very similar kind of housing authority. In Maryland, which acts as the majority controller of some of the new housing that is going up, and as a as a majority stakeholder in these buildings has major sway in things like where the revenues get directed once the costs have been met and what the rents are. In the article, the biggest example that I talk about is actually in Vienna, Austria, though. And this is one of the most fully realized examples that we have out there that we can look to and kind of model ourselves after. So in Vienna, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it's something like 80% of residents in Vienna qualify for public placement in publicly owned, publicly democratically controlled housing or social housing. I think the income limit is something like 70,000 euros a year. If you make that or less, you are eligible to get into these properties. And then once you are in it, they don't check again. It's not a constant means testing. If you make $1 over some poverty line that we've set, then you're out. And so the result is you have these communities that have been living in these housing structures since, for decades or for generations. And that's something that if you look around New York today, you look in neighborhoods like, Bed-Stuy and Greenpoint and Williamsburg and, tons of neighborhoods in New York, you see these communities that have been living here the Lower East Side, that have been living there for generations that now are being thrown out because their rents are just skyrocketing and there's no stability in place, and there's not that much. The real estate lobby has won that battle, and they're losing their homes. And so if you look at, there's a couple of different examples. There's another one in Atlanta too, but or in Atlanta, they're trying to form a very similar housing authority. But yeah, this is not a new idea. This is not something that we're just doing on a wing and a prayer. This is a method that we know works, and especially when done in conjunction with things like rent regulations and good cause eviction laws, can really radically cut down on the speculative, speculation on buildings and, let alone.
It's a proven concept.
Yes.
Yeah. So, all right. Lastly, Cea, where are we with this legislation? Like how down the line? I would imagine the biggest fight against this legislation is coming from the real estate lobby that is focused around New York City. But this would have real benefit, it seems to me, and would work even less with less friction in, the rest of the state, where you don't have the sort of like the same type of like a real estate lobby, and you can alleviate housing crises that are happening in some of these other, more semi-rural counties with just a couple of projects. But where are we legislatively? Like, what are the chances of this, and where is it in the context of like the way that Albany operates?
Yeah. That's a good question, and you say something that I really strongly agree with, that the potential that this model has to do development in places where like Utica or Buffalo or Syracuse, like places where the math is such that you really have to spur gentrification in order to entice a developer to build, and the negative impacts that would cause for low-income renters in those places. I love this concept. I love the concept of the public sector developer, because it's just as easy for a publicly motivated company to be building in distressed Western New York cities as it is in Bed-Stuy or Crown Heights, some of the most gentrified parts of our state. So it's great. In terms of where we are in the process, we introduced the bill in February. And a lot of people signed on. It really made a splash. And we are in the process right now of recruiting a majority of co-sponsors who will, fight for this bill to happen in the state budget. We're already seeing some progress. The Senate included some sort of similar concepts to what's in our SHDA bill and sort of their version of the budget that came out this Monday. So they said in their budget, we should create a new state entity that should be building on state-owned land. They sort of narrowed the vision to just build on existing state-owned land. So we're heartened to see that there's like growing support, including from places like the legislative leadership in the state Senate. But we don't want to limit the proposal to state-owned land. We don't want to limit the proposal to like the handful of sites that New York already has, and we don't want to limit the proposal to our existing finance programs at HCR. So I think we're already making some key progress. I'm really heartened by how quickly it's moving, and I think that it's going to be a several years fight to make the thing passable in the form that we need it to pass in. And I think we're up to it.
Folks, if folks living in New York, call your assembly people, call your senators, and tell them that you are in favor of what is the does it have a bill number in the Senate and then the House, or at the very least Social Housing Development Authority, promoting that? But is there a number?
It does have a bill number. So the bill number is S8494 in the state Senate, and it's sponsored by Senator Cordell Clear, who's amazing, and A9088 in the Assembly. It's sponsored by Emily Gallagher in the State Assembly. She is a member of our Socialists in Office Committee in the Democratic Socialists of America.
Great. All right. And if we can get those numbers, we'll put them in the podcast and YouTube description and on majority.fm. Nicholas, Boni, Cea Weaver, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.